It was the kind of moment that lingered like the fading glow of dusk over Jordan Pond. I remember that day cold and quiet, the kind of silence that wraps around your bones, refusing to let go. A light breeze moved the branches of the old pines, and the scent of moss and damp earth hung in the air. But it wasn't just the forest that was still. Something else deeper seemed to hang in the air, as though the whole place was holding its breath. And then, like a whisper too faint to catch, I noticed it, the shadow just out of reach, flickering on the edge of my vision. It wasn't until much later that I realized what it was. The soundless rustling of things being hidden, deliberately, quietly, deep within the trees. It wasn't an animal, not the usual rustle of a squirrel or a bird shifting in the underbrush. It felt wrong. An unease settled over the scene, unnoticed at the time, but undeniable now. It was only a small movement, the shifting of leaves beneath a rock, but it stayed with me the way the world was holding its breath. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from and follow if you believe some names should never fade. I've spent years walking the trails of Acadia National Park, more time than most people could ever imagine. When you live in Bar Harbor long enough, you get used to the rhythm of the seasons, the slow march from warm summer afternoons to chilly fall evenings, the smell of pine needles clinging to the air. But there was a kind of stillness that autumn of 2011 that I hadn't felt before. The air seemed to thicken like something was holding it back from moving. The tourists had started thinning out by the middle of October. The leaves were starting to fall, their bright colors muted under the darkening sky. People in town began their preparations for the winter months, closing up cottages, bringing in boats, and packing away the kayaks and bikes until the next season. The cool breeze from the Atlantic would bring in fog late in the day, and by night the town seemed quieter, like everyone was tucked inside, savoring the last of the warmth. Most mornings I'd wake up before the sun, the scent of wood smoke drifting from chimneys in the distance. The streets were still wet from the fog, the pavement slick with mist that had settled overnight. The light would stretch thin across the trees as the sun started climbing, but the mornings always felt like they were just waiting for something to change. Maybe that's why I noticed when Brittany Roberts arrived in town that October. She wasn't a tourist like most others, no frantic snapping of photos or loud laughter with friends. She came alone. Brittany, at 31, was a striking woman. A Portland art director, she had a look about her that made her stand out without even trying. That bright fire-colored jacket she wore as she walked into the gas station in Bar Harbor that morning, the one she joked was all she needed, along with a camera and a compass, stuck with me. She had a plan, a vision in her mind, and she was determined to capture it. She wanted to find a piece of Acadia that no one had ever seen hidden somewhere in the forest. I remember her briefly chatting with Cindy Morrison, the woman behind the counter at the Coastal gas station. She was friendly if a little distracted. Cindy said she was heading off to take photos, saying it was just her and the woods. That was the last anyone saw her before she disappeared. She didn't check in at the visitor log at Jordan Pond, and nobody knew exactly where she was heading, but she had the look of someone who was used to being on their own. For a while, it was just another solitary trek, another adventure to add to the long history of those who hiked the park's forgotten trails. I didn't think much of it at the time. Many people came through here looking for peace, for solitude, for their own adventure, but I should have noticed then the way the forest had begun to feel a little different. The wind seemed to shift, carrying a chill that had nothing to do with the weather, but I didn't think about it then. I was too busy with the quiet rhythms of my own life. The days passed, and the forest remained unchanged. The maples shed their red and orange leaves, the tourists disappeared, and the park grew quieter. But by the time the end of October came around, there was a quiet unease in the air, like something was missing, though no one knew exactly what. It wasn't until Brittany didn't return, until her family began asking questions, that it finally hit me. We had all been blind to what had been hiding in the shadows. It was one of those things that felt so small at the time, something you wouldn't notice until it was too late. It was a small detail, a small change in the rhythm, like a slight pause in a song. That night, as the fog rolled in thick over the trees, I remember standing at the edge of the woods, looking out toward Jordan Pond, watching the light fade away into darkness. There was something about the way the shadows settled over the park that night. It wasn't just the fog. It was something else, something that couldn't quite be placed. Something was wrong, but at the time, no one knew just how deep it went. The next day, the silence became more pronounced. The phone calls from the family, the questions, the search. Nothing had led to her. And yet, as I stood at the edge of the woods once more, the fog swirling the silence in the trees seemed to whisper one thing we had missed. Something important. Something was still out there. Something was still hiding in the shadows. The first sign that something was wrong came early. I was sitting in my old chair by the window watching the fog roll in over the park. It wasn't unusual, not this time of year. The cool bite of October air always brought it in, thick and silent, covering everything. But something about that morning felt different. I couldn't shake the feeling that the quiet stretched just a little too long, that the shadows in the trees held something just out of reach. When I heard the phone ring, I didn't think much of it at first. But it wasn't the usual call. It was from Rachel Brittany's sister. I hadn't heard from her in a while, so I picked up quickly. "Hey, Rob. Have you heard from Brittany?" That caught me off guard. She'd left days ago just a solo trip to take some photographs like she always did. Rachel said she hadn't heard from Brittany since the day she left. That wasn't like her. Brittany had a way of checking in at least once a day, letting someone know she was okay. But that hadn't happened this time. At first I thought it was nothing, just a delay. She was hiking in the backwoods of Acadia, after all, in places where even the phone signal had trouble reaching. But when Rachel called again that evening, the first stirrings of worry began to seep into my chest. I could hear it in Rachel's voice, the tightening edge, the uncertainty. Something was wrong. She hadn't returned as planned. Not only that, but her car was still parked at the trailhead. That in itself didn't sit right. It was one thing for someone to be late, but it was another to leave their car behind like that. The next day, I drove up to the park with a sense of unease pressing down on me. The fog was thicker than it had been, swirling around the trees and hugging the ground like a blanket. I've seen Acadia in every kind of weather, but this was different. Everything felt damp and the air hung heavy, like the forest itself was holding its breath. When I arrived, I made my way to the parking lot near the Jordan Pond trailhead, just a mile off the main trail where Brittany had parked her Jeep. There it was, sitting alone, its tires caked with the wet dust of the road. I walked around it looking for any sign that she might have come back, but there was nothing. Not a footprint, not a broken branch, just the sound of the trees swaying in the wind and the faintest trace of her scent on the cool air. I knew the trail she'd been on. I'd walked it myself many times, hidden unmarked, a quiet path far from the usual crowds. The kind of place where people could disappear, where the trees grew thick and the trail twisted between old pines, hiding their secrets. But this time it felt like those woods had swallowed her whole. I walked the path she might have taken, looking for anything: an overturned rock, a discarded backpack, even a broken twig. I don't know what I expected to find, but I had to search. It was my job once to keep these trails safe, to watch over the hikers. But now, with each step, I could feel that familiar rhythm of the park, the stillness, the quiet changing. The deeper I went, the more the unease grew. It wasn't the usual forest quiet where birds call and leaves rustle in the breeze. This was different. The air was too thick, the forest too still. I found a frayed shoelace caught on a rock by a stream. It was a small thing, but it stopped me cold. I bent down, my fingers brushing the wet fabric, and I couldn't help but think of how easily something as small as a loose shoelace could be overlooked. How easily someone could be taken in by the illusion of a peaceful forest, never to return. The stream ahead was swift and cold, the water dark, swollen from the recent rain. The accident theory seemed reasonable enough at first. Maybe Brittany had slipped, lost her footing, and been swept away. but as the hours passed, that story didn't sit right. The search continued for a couple of days, but nothing came up. No sign of Brittany, no body, no sign of a struggle. The only thing anyone found was that damn shoelace. We scoured the area looking for any clue, but it was like she'd simply vanished. People came in search teams, volunteers, dogs, rangers, but the forest wasn't giving up its secrets easily. For days, we combed the area, walking through the underbrush, checking the banks of every stream. We even brought in a helicopter to fly overhead, but no matter how hard we searched, nothing. At first, everyone thought it was just a matter of time. She'd lost her way, maybe. She'd wandered off trail, or she was hurt and couldn't call out. It wasn't until the second night, with the frost creeping in on the ground and the temperature dropping fast, that something started to feel different. By then, it wasn't just the forest that had gone silent. It was the whole town. The usual hum of life, the chatter in the coffee shops, the hum of traffic down Main Street faded away, replaced by a quiet that seemed to press down on the entire place. When Rachel arrived the next day, it was clear that this wasn't just a lost hiker situation. I saw the way she moved, the way she asked questions, trying to stay calm but on edge. Her hands shook as she went over the same details with anyone who would listen. It was hard for her to accept what was happening, hard for all of us, but it was clear that this wasn't like the others. Something was wrong, and the silence from the park only confirmed it. For days, I stayed in touch with the others, following the trail deeper into the woods, hoping for something, anything to show that Brittany was still out there. But the more we searched, the more we found that the woods had closed in, protecting its secrets. The town began to feel different. The longer the search went on, the heavier the air grew. People in Bar Harbor started to talk whispers in the grocery store, hushed conversations at the post office. There was an unease in the air, something everyone felt but no one could name. I drove back through town in the late afternoon, the headlights of my truck cutting through the fog. The light seemed to hang heavy in the mist, like it couldn't quite push through the blanket of gray. I stopped for a moment at the corner where the trailhead was looking back at the empty parking lot. No one had come back yet. I could feel the weight of it then, a quiet, gnawing weight that settled into my chest. The sun was setting and there was still no word. Not a phone call, not a sign. Only the quiet hum of the streetlights flickering on, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. The world seemed to hold its breath. I didn't know it yet, but what we were facing was a long silence, one that would stretch on far longer than any of us expected. The morning the sheriff's office arrived felt like the shift between night and day. There's a kind of energy that comes with the first sign that things are bigger than you realized. When I pulled into the parking lot at the trailhead, I saw the flashing lights of the deputy cars. They had that urgent low hum like the air had just thickened. More came after volunteers in bright jackets, rangers from the Park Service, search dogs with their handlers. The sound of radios crackling, the hurried briefing, the cold morning air filled with tension. You could feel it in the ground beneath you, the anticipation. This was no longer just an old man trying to find some lost hiker. This was serious. This was a search. I remember walking over to one of the rangers and, for the first time really seeing it, this wasn't just a few days of searching anymore. It was an operation. They were talking maps, marking areas on the hoods of trucks. Each location on the map being crossed off, redrawn, reassessed. The hum of the helicopters overhead felt louder now, cutting through the fog. Drones hovered silently, scanning the areas we couldn't reach by foot. There was a quiet dread when each team came back, their faces drawn, their hands empty. Clear, they'd say, and that word stuck in the air heavy as lead. We combed every inch of those trails. The ravines, the overlooks, the scrubby underbrush. The search dogs sniffed, but they couldn't find anything beyond the river. The scent trail just vanished. The deeper we got into the woods, the quieter it felt. I'd seen people lost in these woods before, but not like this. The forest didn't usually feel so heavy, so thick. It wasn't just the fog. It was the weight of the unknown pressing down. It was like the trees were holding their breath, waiting. What we found, or rather didn't find, kept gnawing at me. A footprint, for instance. It was a good find, but it didn't match Brittany's shoes. We had expected to find something, anything, that could help us understand. But every lead fizzled out. A scrap of clothing by the stream, but it was from someone else, not Brittany. A piece of gear discarded and weathered, but it was old. The dogs had been led there by a fresh scent, but they, too, gave up as if whatever had been there just disappeared. There was one spot where we thought we were close, a campsite hidden in the thicket not far from where Brittany had parked her Jeep. A small tent. Blankets piled in the corner, a makeshift fire pit. But no Brittany. No sign of anyone except the remains of an old campfire and the scent of wood smoke lingering in the cold air. I remember the way the light hit that place, how it looked so ordinary at first. But once you stepped closer, it didn't feel right. It was like it was meant to be found, but not by us. As if someone had been expecting the searchers leading us along without ever being seen. At first, we all clung to that hope, hoping there'd be a sign, hoping we'd turn a corner and find her, maybe just off the trail, tired and cold but alive. But the more time passed, the harder it became to ignore the growing sense that maybe she wasn't just lost. Maybe she was never coming back. Theories started to shift. What began as an accident, as some simple mishap, started to feel like something else. The locals, those who had lived here for years, started talking just softly at first about things they'd heard over the years. They spoke about the old paths, trails, long-forgotten places where accidents had happened before. I remember hearing murmurs about the ghosts of the forest, a term I'd heard before but never took seriously. It was the kind of thing people say when they've lived here too long, when the silence of the woods starts to feel too oppressive. But there was something else. The deputies they were keeping to themselves, exchanging looks I couldn't quite place. It wasn't the kind of look that spoke of a missing hiker. It was something deeper, something they weren't saying out loud. I didn't want to admit it, but I could feel it creeping in. This wasn't a simple lost person case. Rumors about the hermit came back too, the one who had lived in the northern parts of the park years ago. I'd heard the stories about the odd carvings left in the trees, the strange man who never seemed to leave, always hiding in the woods. People had seen him back then, or at least thought they did. He'd been known to carve faces into the bark of the trees and leave them for anyone who wandered by. But none of that had ever seemed real until now. I remember a conversation I overheard between two deputies. One said, "You ever hear about the carver? This could be like that." The other just nodded, but his face was tight. And that was it. They didn't talk about it after that. It was the kind of exchange that left you with more questions than answers. It was like they knew something but weren't ready to say it. In the quiet moments between searches, we'd gather at the edge of the trail or around the trucks with the maps spread out and talk in circles. Everyone had their own theory. Some said she had gotten lost and gone off the trail, wandered into the thickest parts of the park where the forest swallowed you whole. Others wondered if something more sinister was at play. A person could get lost in these woods, yes. But for someone as familiar with the park as Brittany, someone who knew the trails, the rocks, the rivers, it didn't make sense. It wasn't adding up. I remember how the tension hung in the air, thick, like the fog rolling over the pines. The volunteers, the rangers, they were all doing their best, but it was clear from the way they moved that the weight of this case was starting to break through the facade. No one was saying it, but we all felt it. There was a darkness in those woods that we weren't prepared for. At the end of the day, we had nothing. Not a single new lead, not a footprint, not a clue. The sun began to sink lower, casting long shadows across the park, and the cold bite of the evening air settled in. The stillness had a way of settling deep in your bones. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. It wasn't until just after dark that I saw him. One of the deputies, his face pale, walking toward me from the edge of the woods, holding something in his hands. He didn't have to say anything. The way he moved, slow, deliberate. It was enough to tell me something had changed. There was something in his hands, something I didn't want to see, but I knew I had to. The quiet that followed his approach felt like it stretched for miles. The day the search shifted is etched in my memory like the moment when the first light of a storm breaks through the sky. We were all exhausted by then, running on little more than hope and determination. The hours had stretched long, and the heavy silence of the forest had begun to sink into our bones. The search teams had fanned out, combing through thick underbrush, following leads that felt increasingly like dead ends. And then, just after midday, the air changed. It wasn't immediate, but I could feel it, a shift, subtle at first, like a soft murmur through the trees. It started with a shout from one of the deputies. His voice crackled over the radio, urgent, sharp. "We've got something." I froze. For a moment, my mind couldn't catch up. We had heard those words before, but this time they sounded different. There was no hesitation, no doubt. This was it. I grabbed my jacket and moved toward the sound of the voices. The area had been cordoned off quickly. The Rangers were already there, forming a perimeter, their movements precise and careful. There was no panic, no chaos, but there was tension. I didn't know what they'd found. All I could do was follow the sound of boots crunching through the dead leaves, the occasional murmur of a voice, a radio crackling with updates. We reached the area where the searchers had gathered, a small clearing near an old stone ledge. There was a chill in the air now, colder than before, and the wind picked up, sweeping through the trees. I could smell the dampness of the earth, the sharp scent of pine. But it wasn't just the weather that made the air feel heavy. It was something else, something I couldn't name yet. Then I saw it. A body. A small figure nestled against the stone, partially obscured by a tangle of moss and old branches. It wasn't clear at first, the body so still, so lifeless that it didn't seem real. But the moment the Rangers began to work around the site, carefully lifting branches, clearing the debris, it hit me this wasn't just another piece of the puzzle. This was the truth we had been looking for. I didn't move. I couldn't. My legs felt heavy, and for a moment I stood there rooted to the ground as the world seemed to stop around me. The sound of my breath, shallow and thick, filled my ears. The body was Brittany's. There was no mistake. The clothes familiar, worn like they had been through more than they should have been. And then there was the camera resting beside her, still attached to its strap. I felt a tightening in my chest, a hollow emptiness that had nothing to do with the physical shock of seeing the body. It was something deeper, something old. The investigators didn't rush. They worked with methodical precision, like they had all the time in the world, though I knew they didn't. Every movement was careful, measured, as they examined the body, taking in every detail. The body was cold, far too cold for someone who had only been missing for a few days. Brittany's face, pale, almost waxen, was turned away from me, but I could see the faint outline of what was once a smile. Her hair was tangled with debris, strands of it clinging to the rocks. They moved her gently, the air thick with the weight of what they had found. I couldn't move for a moment. I just stood there watching as they worked, trying to comprehend the reality of what this meant. The place was quiet, too quiet, like the forest was waiting. Shock, grief, numbness. It's hard to describe what hits you first. For me, it wasn't the body, it was the realization that we had failed. We had all failed. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't the forest being unforgiving. This was something deliberate. When they began to examine the scene more closely, I could hear the low murmurs of the investigators, their words overlapping, each trying to make sense of what they were seeing. A campsite of sorts had been set up nearby, but there were no signs of a struggle, no signs of an attack, just the strange placement of Brittany's body by the stone ledge. It was unnerving. The scene felt too staged, too planned. I could feel the knot in my stomach tightening. There were carvings in the stone near her crude faces etched into the surface, just like the ones we'd heard about from the local legends, the ones I never believed in until now. The carvings weren't random. They were too deliberate, and that was the first real hint I had, the first real glimpse into what had happened. This wasn't just a missing hiker. This was something far darker, something twisted that had been hiding right in the woods we all thought we knew so well. As the evidence was catalogued, I tried to hold myself together. I knew they had to work fast, but it was hard to focus. My thoughts kept circling back to Brittany, her smile, the way she'd looked when I'd seen her that morning, so full of life, so sure of her path. She had been walking toward something, toward a mystery, toward a secret in the woods, and now it was all laid out before us, too late to change. I stepped back, trying to regain my bearings, but the scene was already being secured. The area around the ledge was roped off, the perimeter expanding as more deputies arrived. The air felt thick with the realization that we were no longer dealing with a simple missing person case. This was something else entirely. I couldn't stop staring at the place where Brittany had been found. The site was already becoming a marker, a quiet witness to something sinister. I tried not to think about it, tried not to imagine what had happened in those final moments, but the images kept creeping into my mind. The sheriff's office took over, securing the scene, and before long, Brittany's body was carefully transported. The rangers moved like they had all the answers in the world, but I knew they didn't. No one did. The site was a closed chapter, and what followed would be harder to face. The silence around us deepened. We all stood there for a long while, knowing that the truth we had been searching for was finally within reach, but so much of it was still hidden, veiled in mystery. The sheriff spoke to the press quietly. The whispers of reporters began to stir, but the words never reached me. I couldn't hear them. I could only feel the weight of what had just been uncovered, the dark truth that had been waiting there just out of sight. As the site was secured and the investigation moved forward, I knew one thing: nothing would ever be the same. The park, the place that had once felt like a refuge, would now be a reminder of what had happened in the shadows. I left the scene with the quiet weight of it all hanging over me. A new chapter had begun, but the ending, that was still a long way off. That night, I found myself back at the sheriff's office, the radio crackling in the silence. The light from the conference room flickered softly, casting long shadows across the walls. The work was just beginning, but I could already feel the weight of what was to come. And with that, I knew we were stepping into something deeper than any of us had ever imagined. The days after Brittany was found were a blur of activity and silence. The site was secured, of course. The sheriff's office had their hands full, and the rangers were there at all hours, making sure nothing was disturbed. But in that small town, there was nothing ordinary about what was happening. People gathered at the corner diner, at the gas station, in hushed groups, whispering in ways they hadn't in years. They'd seen plenty of missing persons come and go, some come back, some never found. But this was different. Brittany was a part of the town's rhythm, and to have her life torn from them was a jolt no one was ready for. Rachel, Brittany's sister, came back to town after the discovery. The look on her face as she got out of the car, tired, hollow, but determined, was something I won't ever forget. There was no fanfare, no reunion. Just silence and a heavy grief that wrapped itself around everyone. Rachel didn't want to speak to anyone at first, but when she did, her words were calm, though they carried the weight of a broken heart. She'd been hoping for closure, but nothing prepared her for this. She looked at the photos. The police had taken the evidence and just nodded. She already knew. At the sheriff's office, the wheels started turning fast. The team began to piece together what had happened, and that's when the haunting realization began to set in. Brittany hadn't drowned in the river, and she hadn't wandered off. She'd been taken into the woods with purpose to a spot marked by someone who knew the place well. There were signs that she had been led there, not lost. The carving in the rock near her body, the crude faces rough and unfinished, told us more than we wanted to know. We hadn't heard the stories for years, the ones about the hermit in the park, the strange figures who used to carve faces into trees. But now those stories felt a little too close to the truth. Investigators started putting pieces together slowly, methodically, and though there was no immediate suspect, they started looking at people who had lived off the beaten path, people who knew the woods too well. They found old reports about someone who'd been seen in the area, a man, a recluse, the kind of person who had slipped through the cracks for years, living in the wilderness like a shadow. There was even a report from 2009 about sightings of a man who carved faces into the trees to watch over the forest. All those years of whispers of rumors suddenly felt real. It took months before we had a name, Arthur Graves. He was someone the park rangers remembered from the old days, a man who had vanished from the public eye, slipping into the depths of Acadia. He'd built a small camp near the site where Brittany had been found, and when we discovered it, we saw the same eerie carvings on the rocks, the same faces. It felt like something we couldn't undo, something too awful to be real. Arthur Graves was eventually found, but not in the way you'd expect. He'd left a trail of odd clues, things that made no sense until the pieces fit together. We found his campsite, first old abandoned, but still eerily familiar, and then the diary. The one Brittany had never seen, but one that had been left behind for years. It was in that journal we found the truth. He had been watching her, watching all of us. His words, fragmented but chilling, described how he had been carving faces to keep the forest safe, and how he had found Brittany, the lonely girl in blue. The journal confirmed it all. Brittany had stumbled into his territory. He had been waiting for someone. She had no idea. The fact that she was alone in the woods, alone with him, seemed like a twisted kind of fate for someone like Arthur. But the moment he saw her, he'd decided she was going to be part of his world, a world where no one would ever find her again. The investigation didn't bring back. Brittany didn't bring back what we lost. But it did give Rachel and the rest of the town a sense of finality. The case was closed. Arthur Graves was arrested, though by then it felt like justice was a long time coming. He never spoke much during his arrest. His face was as cold and distant as the carvings he left behind. The trial was quick, though not as quick as we hoped. There was enough evidence to charge him, and he was sentenced to life in prison. But even then it felt like something was missing. We hadn't been able to prevent what happened. It was too late for that. The town changed after that. Acadia was never quite the same again. The park, once a place where people went to find peace, now carried an unspoken weight. People looked at it differently. Families who used to picnic near Jordan Pond were now more cautious, more aware of the stillness in the woods. The light in the trees, the way the wind whispered through the pines. It all felt different, a little darker, as if the forest had become a keeper of secrets. I think a part of us all became a little more vigilant after that. The usual rhythms of the town, the quiet hum of daily life seemed to shift. People walked a little faster. They checked the locks a little more often. They didn't speak of it directly, but it was there beneath the surface in the way the locals no longer lingered near the park after dark. The stories we'd heard for years about people disappearing, about strange things happening in the woods, they felt less like stories and more like warnings. For me, it's different. I still see Brittany in the quiet of the morning, her bright fire-colored jacket cutting through the fog. I think about what might have been, what we could have done differently. The park holds its own mysteries, its own secrets, and I carry those memories with me. Even as life goes on, as seasons change and the town shifts back into routine, I still feel the weight of what happened there in the silence between the trees. I think about Brittany's family too. Their lives will never be the same. Rachel especially. She carries it with her, a quiet grief that never truly leaves. And the town. It carries the same burden. Acadia is no longer just a place for pictures or hikes. It's a place where something terrible happened, and no one can forget that. When I walk through the park now, I can't help but look for the faces on the rocks, the ones that Arthur Graves carved. I can't help but wonder how many others there are hidden just out of sight. The forest will always have its shadows, its secrets, and there are things that will always remain even if no one speaks of them. But the truth, that's what we carry with us. That's the part that stays. If you're still here with me, let me know where you're listening from and follow the channel so these stories are never forgotten.